Up until this point, we've seen the conflict in Vietnam over the presidencies of Eisenhower and Kennedy. And in both of these administrations, obviously the underlying idea has been to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism under this umbrella idea of domino theory by propping up their government with aid and money and what we're calling military advisors, which are essentially military commanders whose job it is to go and help the South Vietnamese troops supposedly learn how to fight better. And what we have to really keep in mind here is that all of this is happening under the broader structure and broader umbrella of the Cold War. Both the Korean War and the conflict in Vietnam were what we call proxy wars to the Cold War, which means that even though we call the Cold War a Cold War because there wasn't any actual fighting between us and the USSR, there was actual fighting in these proxy wars between us and their allies or sort of satellite nations out in Asia. So even though it's been like 10 to 15 years since the beginning of the Cold War, we have to continuously think of the conflict in Vietnam under the broader strategy of containment, because that's what it is. And so by the time we get to the Johnson administration, since Kennedy is assassinated and then Johnson wins his own election, things in Vietnam have changed. If you remember from our last discussion in Vietnam, Diem wasn't really working out for us. His oppression of peasants in South Vietnam caused all kinds of problems, since poor people are the exact kinds of people who fall to communism in the first place. And so the US assassinates him, or at least the CIA, and replaces him with a new puppet. So fast forward to 1964. In the Gulf of Tonkin, which is off the coast of Vietnam, you've got a US naval ship that's supposedly attacked by North Vietnam. Now, what happens in the immediate aftermath of this is incredibly sticky for several reasons. One, at the time, there's not really a clear indication of what's going on. They're aware that there's been an attack of some kind, but even the president's intel can't confirm how many or of what kind. So the understanding is that the USS Maddox has been attacked, but then there's reports of a second engagement that we can't really confirm. And then two, the circumstances of this attack are incredibly sketchy. So if you look at the map here, the Maddox was clearly hanging out safely in South Vietnamese waters for a bit until it went dallying around in North Vietnamese waters. Now, it's not lost here. We pay our sailors, well, not lots of money, but money, to explicitly not get lost and start wars. So these men were clearly told to go hang out in North Vietnamese waters. And obviously they went and did like donuts around there too. This is provocation. They were intentionally trying to get fired at. So Johnson goes running to Congress and is like, oh my gosh, they shot at our ships. And if we know anything about U.S. history at this point, it's that the U.S. is really not a fan of people messing with our boats or sailors. Like, we learned this with impressment in the War of 1812, the USS Maine, the Lusitania, which was not technically ours, but that's cool. And then like the whole Navy base at Pearl Harbor. And so Congress overwhelmingly passes a joint resolution called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that they just conveniently drafted 6 months before this, that hands Johnson what we essentially call a blank check. So if you've never used a check before, since most of us are using credit cards these days, if someone writes a check to you from their bank account and signs the bottom but doesn't write in a dollar amount, you can literally essentially write in any amount you want and the bank will cash that as long as that person has that amount of money in their account. So Congress is essentially giving Johnson full military powers here without declaring war. According to this measure, he can do whatever he thinks is necessary in order to keep the United States safe within what would normally be his military powers as commander-in-chief. And so this is really the point where we start to see a major change in our strategy in Vietnam. It's during Johnson's administration, immediately following the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that the U.S. efforts in what up to that point had been essentially supposed to be a civil war start to pick up in terms of actual boots on the ground. This happens in tandem with an aerial bombing campaign called Operation Rolling Thunder on account of the noise, which was essentially a continuous or sustained bombing raid over North Vietnam from 65 to 68 that disrupted North Vietnamese supply routes and was meant to create essentially chaos. So in addition to this aerial campaign, the Johnson administration began sending normal troops, not just advisors, to fight in addition to South Vietnamese troops. In 1965, the draft increased to 35,000 people per month, which you can pretty clearly see here on the chart. And by 1968, there were more than 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. When it comes to the makeup of these troops, it's important to realize that the conflict in Vietnam had a pretty high level of disproportion when it comes to the draft and the people being sent to overseas to fight, both in terms of race and class. As you can see from our chart here of African Americans in the Vietnam War, the bottom half of the chart in blue-green colors shows the percentage of African Americans in the general population versus the percentage inducted into the military to fight overseas. As a general side note, not everyone drafted is ultimately inducted, since at least some percentage is always rejected due to physical requirements, psychological exams, and any number of other things. We'll touch on this again in a second. If things are equitable, these numbers should be pretty much equal, but you can see here that they're obviously not. This disparity is even greater when you look at the percentage of African Americans in the general population versus the percentage among troops killed in combat. This could be due to any number of things. One, African Americans wounded in action could be receiving less adequate medical care due to racism or segregation. Two, African Americans could be given less reliable or older equipment, as is historically the case in the military. Or perhaps three, African Americans are being sent on more dangerous or even suicide missions, as is also often the case in the military when it comes to minorities. What complicates this further is that African Americans are incredibly more likely to be in Vietnam in the first place, putting them at risk to begin with, because of the way that the draft is set up. When people were called up by the draft board, they were able to be exempt through several means. College, for example, is a popular way to get out of being drafted. Another was to get a note from your doctor to say that there was something wrong with you. Now, you didn't want it to be something too wrong with you because that would make you unhireable for other jobs or cast you with some kind of stigma. So it had to be something wrong, but not too wrong. Donald Trump, for example, is now famous for avoiding service in Vietnam with several educational deferments, and then when those ran out, one medical deferment for bone spurs. Bill Clinton also avoided service in Vietnam for using educational deferments and then joining the ROTC. In any case, these kinds of deferments were expensive. College back then wasn't nearly as expensive as college is today, but it wasn't like you could just wake up one morning and rush off to attend. On top of that, we already know that African American students were at both a financial and educational disadvantage when it comes to college attendance in the 60s. Setting aside even just the cost, the segregation of schools throughout the country for this nation's entire history meant that the vast majority of black schools received inadequate funding, had inferior textbooks and supplies, and couldn't afford to send their teachers to training to learn about the most recent trends in pedagogy. This meant that often African American students were behind on the benchmarks required to make it into a lot of colleges across the country. And that's assuming that colleges weren't finding ways to circumvent federal laws banning segregation to begin with. And so when we look at the people who were drafted to Vietnam, those people tended to overwhelmingly come from poor and or minority communities. People, sometimes regardless of race, who didn't have the means to defer or exempt themselves or their families through these loopholes in the system. And so much like the Civil War, we see that the conflict in Vietnam is referred to by many as a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. The men who are sent to Vietnam, whoever they end up being, face some really difficult, to put it lightly, obstacles when they get there. The fighting in Vietnam is essentially just guerrilla warfare, which, to be fair, we're not totally unfamiliar with since we've been engaging in this style of warfare in the United States for centuries now against Native Americans, and in the Philippines and Cuba, and in World War II to an extent in Japan. And so the style of warfare here is actually not the issue. What the issue is in Vietnam is the environment. Vietnam is a jungle, essentially. There are dense forests and some sort of swampy areas that we're just really honestly not accustomed to in the United States. We don't really have anything equivalent. The closest thing would be something like jungles in South America. And so when we're engaging in guerrilla warfare in Vietnam, the US is at a serious disadvantage because the terrain is just not on our side. Never mind the fact that it's not our country, but literally the ground we're walking on often just gives way because it's been raining for weeks. Now add to that these booby traps, which were hidden all over the place by the North Vietnamese and by us. Starting on the right here, we've got a pretty obvious set of just spikes in the ground. So these would be covered by this grass rectangle here that really only is loosely patched together so that when someone stepped on it with their whole body weight, they'd fall through it. And one of these spikes would go through the bottom of their foot. Now, this isn't going to kill you unless the spike also has poison on it, which it might, but it will definitely knock you out of service, and you're probably losing that foot. The device in the middle would be hung up in a tree, and when someone hit a tripwire, it would come swinging down and hit you, hopefully, if designed right, essentially right in your midsection. So, in theory, if it hits right, this thing would probably do enough damage to kill you. Or if it hit someone else before hitting you, you would have some broken bones or maybe damaged insides and be in the hospital for a while. And then the third one, here on the bottom left, is a bit like the one on the right, just worse. So if you fall into this one, since it would be covered in grass, you're probably going to end up, if you're lucky, with your entire leg stuck with the spikes in it. If you're not lucky, you fell right down into the middle of it and your whole body got essentially impaled until you got stuck. And now you're probably like waist deep and bleeding out. But let's just say you've got yourself early stuck in it. So you're just like thigh deep in this and you have two of these metal spike things in your leg. There's a bummer, and you're probably in a crapola of pain. The problem here, apart from maybe dying, is that one, you need to shut up and stop screaming so you don't give away your position, and two, you need to either pull your leg out the same way it went in and re-stab yourself along the way, or wait until they can dig that thing out of the ground and bust it open and pull the spikes out of your leg. And that would be assuming that you haven't hit any major blood vessels that will rupture and immediately cause you to bleed out and die. So these are really simple contraptions, but they cause really serious damage. And because the jungle floor is absolutely covered in grass and leaves and other stuff, it's really difficult to see them until it's too late. Same goes for tripwires and other detonators that will explode and blow people's legs off. The other problem for US troops here is that the whole process of guerrilla warfare entails sneak attacks, and the way that the North Vietnamese troops did this was by using elaborate tunnel systems underground. So they'd come out to attack and then go back into hiding, but it was pretty impossible for the Air Force or anyone else to find their base camps using spy planes because everything they had was underground, which honestly is really genius if you think about it. And the biggest problem that the US had was that they didn't know where the entrances to these underground caverns were. They thought if they could figure out the mystery, it would be easier to attack and weed out their enemy, because half of any war strategy is to isolate the enemy and essentially starve them out. But if you don't know where their base is, that's a really difficult thing to even attempt to do. In response to not being able to find or defeat their chosen enemy, the United States starts on a mission of indiscriminately devastating Vietnamese villages and countryside in an attempt to find North Vietnamese troops. The army grows increasingly paranoid that the people of South Vietnam are harboring North Vietnamese fighters and become more and more unwilling to see a distinction between the people they're supposed to be there to help and protect and the people they're meant to be there fighting against. And so the US military introduces two newish weapons to use in this fight, which are used across Vietnam. Napalm is a chemical agent that's used in incendiary bombs, so exploding fire bombs, and flamethrowers to make the gasoline and fuel in those devices stickier and longer burning. The problem here is that when napalm bombs explode, or when a flamethrower with napalm is used around people, that chemical gets on those people and is incredibly difficult to get off. And when it hits the skin, it starts a chemical burning reaction that literally melts the skin. In our image here of the mother carrying her toddler, you can see at the bottom of the baby's feet that there is skin falling off from where it's been exposed to the chemicals. In another really famous photo of a young girl, she's running away from her village completely unclothed with her arms held out and away from her body because she took all of her clothes off in order to keep the napalm that got on them from sinking in and burning the fabric onto her skin. Today, napalm is technically illegal per the United Nations, but a slightly altered chemical component has still been used by the United States all the way up to our engagements in Afghanistan. The other new aspect of chemical warfare we see in Vietnam is called Agent Orange on account of the color. This is an herbicide, meaning it kills plants. So the entire idea here is that if our problem is that we can't find the North Vietnamese troop locations or tunnel systems because of the dense jungle, we need to get rid of the jungle. This is military problem solution 101. So they take this substance and spray it from planes and helicopters all over the jungle. You can see the side effects of it in our before and after photo here on the right. The top and bottom photos are the exact same location, just flipped angles. Now, in addition to the super obvious environmental disaster that this caused, there's a huge problem for the Vietnamese population. because this chemical seeps into the river there, and even if the people that live along that river are smart enough to know not to drink the water after it's been compromised, the people downriver obviously didn't know what happened, so they go on washing their food and drinking the water like normal. And so this clearly dangerous chemical is ingested by pregnant women, and they end up having complicated pregnancies, and some women miscarry, and many women have children who end up with improperly formed skull plates, or conjoined skulls in the case of twins. And for the mothers giving birth, some of these skull deformities can cause serious complications and even death during childbirth. And it's not just the children and their mothers in Vietnam that have medical issues as a result of Agent Orange. The chemicals also caused cancer in the men who handled it. The US stopped using the chemical in the 70s and destroyed the rest of the supply at the end of the decade after destroying crops and forests totaling essentially the size of Massachusetts. Both domestically and in terms of foreign policy, calling 1968 a tense year would be a wild understatement. Specifically focusing in on Vietnam here, though, the year started with the first organized attack by the North Vietnamese on a handful of South Vietnamese cities and military targets called the Tet Offensive. In US textbooks, we typically refer to the North Vietnamese as the Viet Cong, although that's really not the best term. The more correct term for them is the National Liberation Front. The move itself was actually a massive military failure for the North Vietnamese troops, which makes sense when you think about it since it played against their strength to that point, which was guerrilla warfare. But what did come out of this that made the Tet Offensive a huge turning point in the war was that Americans watching all of this unfold at home, because the media was reporting all of it, realized at that point that this war was far from over. This entire time, they'd been told that victory was at hand, that we were driving forces steadily back. But what the Tet Offensive showed the average people of the United States, watching on their TVs as cities erupted in violence, was that nothing was guaranteed and nothing was over. And after General Westmoreland requested 200,000 more troops in March, public opinion turned against the war in a way that it hadn't in the past, and in a way that would continue gradually toward greater anti-war sentiment. The Tet Offensive stretched from January to September. By March, a lot of the initial damage was already done, and a lot of casualties already mounted on the side of the United States. It's at this point that the Charlie Company of the 11th Infantry Brigade were sent to the Sun Mai area to look for National Liberation Front troops. When they arrived at the village of My Lai, it was apparent that the people in the village weren't North Vietnamese fighters. Nobody in the village was even of military age. They were elderly men and women with children. But the commanding officer, William Calley, ordered the men of Charlie Company to kill everyone and burn the village. Not a single Vietnamese villager fired on an American soldier. The only American wounded shot himself in the foot on accident. But in the end, American soldiers massacred over 500 South Vietnamese villagers, and they proceeded to cover it up for over a year. When the scout helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson tried to report the massacre, the military assigned him to increasingly dangerous missions. It wasn't until the story was leaked to journalists in 1969 that the public became aware of the massacre. With the exception of William Calley, everyone involved in the My Lai massacre was acquitted. Calley was found guilty of premeditated murder in 1971, but paroled in 1974. One of the bigger topics of discussion to come out of 2020 has been the potential for renaming military bases that are currently named after Confederate military officers. In Texas, Fort Hood is one of those bases, and several news outlets like the Washington Post, the Houston Chronicle, the Dallas Morning News, and the Texas Standard have brought forward the discussion of potentially renaming the base after Texas native and Medal of Honor recipient Roy Benavidez, which begs the question, who was he? Benavidez earned the Medal of Honor during his service in Vietnam. According to the official record read by President Reagan during his award ceremony, he volunteered for an extraction team to pick up wounded and dead servicemen. In the process of doing this, he was wounded in his right leg, face, and head. Despite these injuries, he redirected the helicopters to a safer position and then proceeded to carry and drag wounded men to the helicopters. He then returned for another round of men and recovered the body of their team leader in some classified documents. At this point, he was severely wounded in the abdomen and back, and some accounts say he had to hold in his own intestines, and his helicopter pilot was wounded and crashed. Benavides grabbed the classified documents, helped the wounded out of the overturned helicopter, and then called in a tactical support while suppressing fire and calling for another extraction team. When the second extraction team arrived, he neglected care of his own injuries to make sure that his wounded men were aboard the helicopter and classified materials were either secured or destroyed. Only then did he allow others to pull him into the extraction aircraft. As you can see from the very end of the commendation, which is here on the screen, his actions saved the lives of at least 8 men. The escalation of the conflict in Vietnam in the 60s both reflected cultural and economic tensions already present in American society and intensified tension that was lingering below the surface. As draft numbers and the death toll rose throughout the Johnson administration and the war appeared, to some at least, increasingly unwinnable, conversations about long-lasting American foreign policy intertwined with those about confidence in the government's ability to do right by the American people at large. And for the Johnson administration in particular, success or failure in Vietnam had a tremendous impact on success or failure in domestic policy.